recording. Seems like it's recording. All right, good deal.
Yes.
I feel technology inept tonight. What's going on here? I don't know what's happening. Anyway, welcome everybody. So today we are going to chat about developing library policies. So if you weren't planning on talking about that, you are in the wrong place. But the reason that I wanted to have developing library policies for a topic that we were going to chat about is because one, we have to make sure that we are having all of our policies up to date as much as humanly possible, because with the new updated minimum standards, and Sandy mentioned this a little while ago, is we need to have all of our policies updated. So I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody in just a second. Sorry, I was getting some feedback. All right, there we go. Okay. Anyway, so with the update to minimum standards, people need to be able to have all of their policies up to date and on their websites on a regular flowing basis. So for most policies, it needs to be updated every 5 years. We'll get into that a little bit as we talk through policy basics, the different types of policies, what you'll need from start to finish in terms of writing policies, the idea of policy development, some considerations, and then some other resources that I have. If you have questions during this, go ahead and drop it in chat, and then Suzanne will unmute herself and let me know. And I can take those as they come, or if you want to wait until the end, that's perfectly fine too. I'm going to go ahead and put this page in chat so you have a link to it, but I will also make sure that I send this out to everybody in an email after the fact. Okay. So the first item that we have coming up is policy basics. So this comes straight from the trustee handbook, and I have little links here that brings you directly to that page in the trustee handbook in case you want to read about library policies here. But it's more fun to listen to me. So I'll go ahead and rap about this for a second. But it reads, policy is perhaps the most difficult part of a trustee's job. Don't be afraid. Requiring an open mind, a thoughtful study of the issues involved, and a deep understanding of the library's mission and of the community it serves. In addition, clearly reasoned and written up-to-date policies provide the library with critical legal protection. The reason that you want to have policies in place is because they do not only enforce the rules of the library, but they also can protect you legally, because there are quite a few policies out there where you have to be able to uphold them in a legal regard. For example, if every library must have a conflict of interest policy, a whistleblower policy, a sexual harassment policy. So these ones, they are required, but they will also protect you if you come into a case that has anything to do with things like a conflict of interest, sexual harassment, or a whistleblower situation. So you want to make sure that you have all of those items up to date and for legal protections. Now, underneath, I have a few bullets. I won't go through each one of them, just kind of the highlights of the main ones. But mainly when we're talking about policy, these are the rules of the library. So if you think about kind of how the structure of it, when you're thinking about the laws and how they impact your library, it kind of starts at the top with, so laws and regulations, you obviously have to follow those. And then underneath that comes the library charter. Underneath that are the bylaws. Underneath the bylaws are the policies. And then underneath the policies are the procedures. So it's good to keep in mind that that's kind of workflow from start to finish is how we are going to make sure that we understand and classify the different documents that we're working on. Policies, they're not a fun thing just to have. They are actually required by the education department. You can see in this bullet right here, so 90.2 is the part of law that talks about the library minimum standards. And it says that in order to maintain your charter, you must have policies. And with the updated minimum standards, you must have those policies posted to your website. So you want to keep that in mind too. You have to review them every 5 years. This is to make sure that you have all of your policies up to date and kind of on a regular update schedule. And that's true for most policies. But Suzanne, you want to touch on a few of the policies that you may want to consider updating kind of less than 5 years on a 5-year cycle?
Definitely if you have like any kind of personnel handbook or staff policies that deal with sick time, vacation time, things like that, you definitely want to review those annually. The laws will change, like labor laws, or this year we saw a lot of updates in like sick leave laws. So you want to review those every year at your business meeting and make sure that you're in compliance as far as what you're doing for your staff and with your staff. And then any policies that have to do with technology, we recommend reviewing those like every 2 years, because things change so quickly, they can become outdated. So if you had like an internet policy that was adopted 5 years ago, there's a good chance a lot of that isn't going to match what's going on in your library right now. So technology, I would say every 2 years, but anything personnel you should do annually.
Well put. Now, when you have all these policies and they're on an update cycle and you have them, you have to have them on your website. If your library website does not have a section with all your policies on it right now, at least your external policies, you are out of compliance with the law. So if you go to your library website and you see that they're not there, get those up there right away, because it was the January 1st, 2021 was the deadline to make sure that those were all up to date. And that's also, even if they're all on your website, if they're older than 5 years old, you're still out of compliance. So you're going to want to make sure that you get that remedied right away. Library board's responsible for creating policies, reviewing and revising. You also have the ultimate authority to enforce them and this is with the assistance of the library staff. So if you come to my roles and responsibilities training, policy is always one of those ones that's interesting, because when we talk about board and development, it's kind of like, it's kind of both responsibilities, which it really is. And you have an opportunity as a board to develop them, but you do need that support from your staff, because they're the ones that are actually on the floor enforcing them. You have to make sure that your policies are clearly written and understandable. You should make sure that they're standalone. This is to mean that you don't want to just have one policy, one ongoing policy that you update all at the same time. They should stand alone and be on their own, just in case you need to revoke a policy, if you need to amend a policy, if you're realizing that a policy is against the hierarchy of law. You want to make sure that you're able to update that individually. You should also have the revision dates and the adoption dates on all those policies. I'll talk about that a little bit different a little bit more when I talk about the policy template. Policies should be recorded, compiled, and organized and ready access in a policy manual. So even though these are all standalone, you should have, and a policy manual can just be the list of policies on your website that people can click to and get to. That's fine. Some libraries like to print them all out and put them in a 3-ring binder. That's okay too. Just make sure that you have them up to date. And if you have a printed bound or a printed and bound in some way version of it, just make sure that you note the last time that those policies were updated on the physical copy too. So you know that the policies that you have internally, you have everybody has the most up-to-date version of it, and everybody should have a copy of it and make sure that they understand make sure that you make sure that trustees have a copy of it and that they understand what is contained in that policy handbook, because all trustees, even if it has something to do with an internal operation that maybe the director handles, trustees should have a good knowledge of what that actually is and what they should be thinking about. Okay, any questions before we get into policy types?
Well, I'll just add that I would say when a new trustee comes on board, you should definitely make that part of their orientation, that they either get a copy of your policy manual or they know where to go on your website. And even if you take the time to review the most important policies with them, and then they go and look at other policies later on and come back with any questions to either the director or the rest of the board, but that should be part of their onboarding process.
Well put. I got a private message came in and it says, if you have a chance, describe the difference between bylaws and policies. So a library bylaws are the rules that govern the board. So this is going to talk about the number of trustees that you're going to have, the number of terms that they have, the annual meeting, the meeting schedule, what rules of order you follow, how officers are elected, what officers you have, a lot of times what committees you have. So it's specifically the rules that the board has to follow in order to conduct business, whereas the policies are more of the laws of the library. So you'll have a bunch of different policies that tackle a bunch of different areas. And when you are looking at the bylaws, those are specifically just the rules that the board has to operate under. So those are the differences between the two. Any other questions about those?
Oh, there is, when you're done with that, there is this comment in chat. Which one you read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So it says, it sounds like the entire policy manual needs to be on the website.
Yep. So the way that minimum standards are written is that you have to have all your external policies online. So internal policies like your staff handbook, your pay practices, stuff like that don't necessarily have to be on your website, but anything that that the public is going to be interacting with, all those external policies, which I'm going to get to in just a second, those all have to be on your website, and they can be on there individually, but you're going to want to make sure that and it's probably best if they're there individually, and then that way you can just amend if and when you amend a policy, you can just delete that one off your site and upload the new one. So having them on there like that makes it a bit easier. But that flows into the different policy types. So on here, I have three main types. So internal policies, external policies, and then I have policy versus procedure. So when we're talking about internal policies, these are the ones that govern the interactions between how the board, director, and staff interact with the organization. So if you hear internal policy, it's usually referring to staff handbook, an internal code of ethics that your board would follow, any type of continuing education that you have for staff. Maybe you dedicate 1% of your budget to continuing education every year, and this is how it can be spent. That would be an internal policy. Claims auditing. So that's an internal financial policy. So it could be viewed as an internal or an external one. But for these reasons, we'll talk about it as an internal policy. External policies, these are the ones that are kind of facing outward. These govern the interactions with the community. So when you're talking internal, it's how the staff are interacting with the organization. External is how the community or the public is interacting with the library. So this has to do with customer service, collection development. You should have an unattended children's policy, patron complaints, meeting room policies, things like that. This could be programming, lots of different stuff that you have could fall under external policies that you should have. And when we talk about the difference between a policy and a procedure, so policies are the local law of an organization. Procedures are how those policies are carried out. So policies are they're stronger than procedures. If the board sets a policy and says, here, staff, you now do this policy, they're going to have some type of procedure that then carries out that said policy. So the policy may be that you need to get 3 quotes in order to purchase this item that's X number of dollars. So that's the policy. The procedure is, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to call this person and this person and this person, or I'm going to post it here, here, and here, just to make sure that I get these 3 quotes that I need. So it's the policy is the rule. The procedure is how they actually carry that out. Some procedures are written. Other procedures are just kind of internally updated. And when you think about policy versus procedure, a lot of times, if you haven't reviewed these in a while, you'll notice that policy and procedure kind of become out of alignment. So you'll try to adjust procedure in order to put it back into alignment. But it's sometimes easier because procedures, that day-to-day things that people are doing to carry out a task, it's sometimes easier just to update the policy to match the procedure if it's a legal and appropriate procedure. So when you're doing development, and we'll get this down to the bottom once we start talking about development, when you're doing it, you have to make sure that you understand that policy and procedure, often they go hand in hand with one another. And just because you update one, it doesn't automatically mean that the other one is going to follow. You're going to want to make sure that they balance each other out. Suzanne, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Nope, but we do have a question in chat.
What do we got?
What about the policies that guide the trustees concerning financial rules like bids for spending?
Those would be external policies. So I would consider if I think that's your question. So if you're talking whether internal or external, I would say those ones are external, because if somebody had a question about how a contractor would interact with your policy, well, I guess you could go either way with it. I would put it on your website and consider it an external policy, but if it wasn't on your website, it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get dinged for it. But I think that kind of thing is, if I was a contractor and I wanted to know, what is this function that you're operating on, I would want to be able to read about it and see what it is. I also say that because it's helpful to me very much to be able to have all that stuff on there. And then the follow-up, are they bylaws? So policies that guide trustees concerning financial rules, like for bids and spending, are they bylaw? No, those would not be bylaws. Those would fall under your procurement policies. So the bylaws are just about the officers and the meetings that you have. Procurement is about how many bids you would need for something. And if you're a public library, you would have to follow the Office of the State Comptroller's rules of procurement, which means that if you have a public works project, over 35,000 or something like that, you have to get 3 official bids and then everything underneath that. I can pull up a procurement policy once we get closer to the bottom of this, when I show you the resources that we have too. But yeah, the bylaws are only the meetings, the officers, the committees. And I can send out a copy of some bylaws as well. And there's also some sample bylaws in the trustee handbook. Okay. Next item we have here is what you'll need. So this is what you'll need as you are either going through a full policy overhaul, or if you're working with your policy committee to develop some new policies, or just refreshing the committees that you have. So what I have here, the first item here, we have the recommended policy checklist. This is right in the end of the trustee handbook, and these have them in external and internal. And actually, it looks like financial controls, they do have it in internal controls. So there you go. But I would still love to see those on your website. So this talks about all the recommended policies that you should have. Some of these you may not have, and it's not a big deal. Some of these, if you don't have them, it is a big deal. For example, earlier on when we were talking, when I was talking with people when they were first getting on, there was a credit card policy that was brought up. In order to have a credit card in your library and to use it, it's perfectly fine to do that, but you have to have a credit card policy according to the internal financial controls of the Office of the State Comptroller. So if you have a credit card and you don't have a policy that goes along with it, and you get audited by the Office of the State Comptroller, if you're a public institution, that will come back to bite you. So you want to make sure that you have that one. Same with things like investments or an inventory of fixed assets. Like these things you have to have if you're going to have it. If you're if you're a library and you say, well, we don't want to have a petty cash fund at all, we're just going to do everything through POs and credit card, that's fine. If you don't have petty cash, you don't have to have it. Or you could have a policy that just reads, our policies that we don't have petty cash, or something like that. Other ones of these, like if you're talking about public space, maybe your library doesn't have enough space to offer tutoring, so you don't have a tutoring policy. And that can be okay. You may want a policy that talks about how you don't want specific things in your library if you're not able to accommodate tutors. But that's something that you can consider. So go through this list and think, how does this impact our library? And not just, do we have this or don't we have it? It's what's the long-term implications of these things if we opt not to have a policy about it. Some of them, I know there's a lot of libraries that read through this list and they don't necessarily include a vulnerable adults policy, but they will include an unattended children's policy, or they'll have a programming policy for what they have, but maybe they won't have a specific meeting space policy because maybe they don't have the meeting room. If you do have a meeting room, you need a meeting room policy. If you should always have some type of patron behavior or code of conduct policy, because that's what's going to allow you to enforce whether you're going to have patrons in your library or not in your library for certain behaviors. So some of that, you want to make sure you go through this list and think very critically about them. It's 2 pages, sorry. You'll have to go through each one of these and kind of decide what you have, what you don't have. Personnel policies, these are the ones that Suzanne mentioned earlier that you should look at every year. There's certain, most of these you have to have. If you don't have it, it'll leave your library liable in the case of, in any certain case. So if you look at discipline and termination, let's say you terminate an employee and you don't have a policy to back you up in that case, it could come back and haunt you in a way that you don't want it to. So you want to make sure that these policies are that you've considered all of these, and that you make sure that you have the ones that you need and you have reasons for the ones that you don't need. Next thing that I have on here, so those are recommended policy checklists. Another thing that's kind of helpful, and I just made a simple spreadsheet, and you can download this one if you want, or you can create your own. You can just go to File, Download, and you can download it as an Excel sheet. But what this is, it's just to help you keep track of the policies that you have. So you'll have each individual one. This is just kind of a broad view of it. So you have like the type of policy, the title of it, when it was approved, when it was last updated, and then you just add 5 years when you should review it next, any specific notes, where it is. So this is kind of a critical one too, because when we're talking policy development, one thing that gets libraries so often is we had a trustee, our chair of the policy committee, that was in charge of all these policies, and then they left for Florida or whatever, and now we have no idea where any of these policies are. So you're going to want to make sure that you know what the location is, where you have those. The best type of way to handle these is have Word files on some type of internal library computer or internal drive of some kind, and have a backup copy of them. So if you lose them, or if a computer crashes or something, you don't have to redo all of your policies. So just have it listed where all these policies are. They should all be in the same place. We have OneDrive on our computer where on our internal network here at PLS, and it's in our folders, and it's under board, and it's under policies, and all of the current policies are there in Word file format, and all the old policies are there, just in case we need to go back and look at, why did we make this change, or what change did we make? So make sure you have the location on there, because it seems like a silly thing, but you're going to want to make sure that you have it. And then a list of your current policy committee. And I have a little how to use this template over here, so you can feel free and download that one if you'd like. The current members of the policy committee, every board should have a policy committee, especially considering that you have to have policies and you have to update them every 5 years. And typically, when you have a policy committee, usually it's 2 or 3 trustees, and then the directors included that as well. And their job is to review all of the policies that you currently have, and then make sure that they're on some type of update schedule. They review it to see whether you need to maintain that policy, if you need to update that policy, if you don't need that policy anymore. And what I like to see is not this kind of huge policy project where you go through and you hit all, this entire list of policies in one month span, but just take a couple of them and meet maybe every month or every other month the policy committee, and then update whatever you need to update on them. If they didn't need any updates, that's great. Just put the date on it when the last time it was reviewed on there. That's a really good thing to have on there as well. Just so you know that you've made that approval and that somebody has looked at this policy and considered it within that past 5 years. Another good thing to have before you go through any type of policy project, whether you're updating or developing new one, is some type of policy template. And this is a real simple one that I just put together. You're welcome to use it, but this just kind of gives an idea of the structure of what should be in a policy. So up here, once it loads, you put your little library logo up here. That's great. You put the title of the policy at the top of it. That's obvious. It's optional if you want to have a purpose statement, but it can oftentimes help explain the policy and why you have it in your organization. If there's specific terms in there, having specific definitions is really good. And then you actually have your policy. And then you may need a compliance section too that talks about any specific procedures that need to happen in order to uphold the policy. And again, you'll have copies of all of this stuff, so you're welcome to download this and use this as a guide, or you can create your own. If it's a real simple policy, sometimes I just have the overview of what the policy is in a paragraph form, and that's all I need. If it's a more complex policy, it may include that purpose, the definition, the overview, and then how we stay in compliance with it too. Or sometimes under the compliance, you may reference other specific applicable laws that pop up that you may need to adhere to when you're working on it. All right, let's take, what do we got for questions?
Oh, I was going to ask if you're ready for some questions.
Yeah, throw them at me. All
right, we have a couple. So the
Okay.
first one, do libraries have board policies? For example, director succession plan policies, self-evaluation policy, etc.
It's not a required one, but it's not a bad idea to have them, because basically what you do when you set up those types of policies is you tell future boards, this is how we operate with these. So if you do a self-evaluation of the board, which is a fantastic idea, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and you have a policy that says every year, these are the practices that we conduct to do it, that's great. That would be considered an internal policy that you can just have that the board follows, and that's a really good idea. I like that one.
Okay, what about COVID-19/pandemic policies? I view these types of policies as a living document, but has been challenged given that we are following guidance and not laws, and what is at times conflicting guidance and frequently changing guidance.
Suzanne, do you want to answer this one?
Sure. Well, I can speak to what we did at the system and what we advised libraries to do. So at the outset of COVID, we strongly recommended that libraries put some policies in place that match the guidance coming out from the state and the governor's office, especially ones when it came to like mask mandates, because that was compliance with that what was a safety issue. And it felt like having a policy in place that says like you have to wear a mask to come into our facility, it made the staff feel safer, and it gave the library staff something to point to, like this is now our policy that you have to wear a mask. So at the time, a lot of the guidance that was coming out with New York Forward, we were putting into like policy, and we were having, if boards felt, but most boards did, that they should adopt them, they were. As things started to reopen and we moved through like the different phases, and then things started to maybe roll back a little bit more as we hit the winter, we sent out a recommendation that libraries, since they were like a living document, like what you were saying, and things were changing so fast, instead of having to revise and then readopt these policies at every single board meeting, to have a motion that the library was going to enforce whatever the current guidance was from New York Forward and CDC, and sort of like kind of getting rid of those policies, and they were just more like procedures or guidance going forward. But in the beginning, in March, we did say these should be policies, and now we were saying, and now we're kind of like, yes, they are living documents. They are going to be changing. Like the travel advisory for the health screening, that has changed twice in the past 2 weeks. So that would be a policy that was outdated several times over, the past couple months. So Yes, the only, so we don't think at this point those COVID-19 policies need to be policies anymore. There is that pandemic response plan that does need to be a policy, and that's just a general pandemic response plan, and that needs to be in place by April 1st for all public employers. And that's just how your organization is going to respond to a future pandemic. So it's just like, are you going to have PPE on hand? Where is that stored? Who's responsible for inventorying and ordering that? Who are your essential employees? What are your essential tasks? So just sort of outlining everything that we went through this time. So if there is some sort of pandemic emergency, your organization is able to like kick into gear right away. And it's not that scrambling that we had back in March, like, well, who's essential? What's essential? Who can go to work? Who has to close? Like, this policy will lay that all out. And if there's ever a public health crisis again, your library would then just implement that one. But it's a general policy. And we've sent information out to the directors about that, and we can resend if needed. But the ones specific to COVID-19 aren't necessarily needed to be policies anymore. You can just have a motion to your board that you're following all of the current mandates and executive orders and CDC guidance.
And then just keep an eye on those, because they do fluctuate a lot, which Suzanne and I often have. We send out a briefing to directors every week, and they oftentimes have just various updates that have happened in laws and regulations. And then also, so Suzanne mentioned the pandemic response plan, and there's also internal so there's the infectious disease policy, which is a staff handbook policy. And I can send that out too, but that is one that you'll want to have. And it basically, again, it kind of outlines who is going to be at the library. What do you do if somebody comes in sick? How do you handle that? So those types of general things. But like Suzanne said, the rest of it can be just procedural on how you're handling it. Okay, what else we got for questions?
Can the required review be limited to the committee, or does it need to involve the entire board? So I guess like that annual or 5-year.
Yeah, good question. So the review of it and the updates and things can happen in committee, but it has to appear on your board agenda, and the board has to approve it. So you can't just have your committee say, okay, it's approved. You have to bring it to the full board, and you have to have a motion that updates those policies. And it doesn't have to be each individual policy. You could have a motion, like I think for the last one we had, it was that adopts the policies in the date policy update project or something. And then we just listed all the policies that were reviewed. But your board actually does have to take action on those to make them legal policies. Even if they're already in place, the review or the amendments and all that stuff need to have a motion.
And this one is very familiar because we just did this at ours. If all policies are transferred to the same formatted template, but no text is changed, does the board need to approve the format change?
I usually, technically no, because you're not changing the content of the policy. But if you, it's safer to do it, because let's say you transfer the whole thing over and you notice that it's missing a period or a comma, or there's a word spelled wrong. Technically, that's no longer the policy. If you fix that, technically it's no longer the policy that was approved by the board. So usually when I do those, I show the board the updates that I've done to it, even if it's just cosmetic, and I have them approve it anyway, just because I feel like it's a bit safer, and you get a newer date on when it was. So if you went through and just updated a handful of them, just have the board take a look and approve them. But technically, if no content is being changed, you can get by with it as long as all the dates and everything are on there correctly.
And if there are no changes, does it still require board action?
If there's no changes, no, but you want to make sure that if it's something where you have to make sure it's updated every 5 years, don't skip it, because you need to have that review date on there within the past 5 years. So if you just looked at your credit card policy and you're like, yep, everything's fine in here, and the last time I looked at it was 2015, it's an out-of-date policy. So you're going to want to have the board approve that as reviewed, so you can put that new date down at the bottom, so it's no longer out of date.
That's the end of questions for right now.
Cool. So these, and I'm really into project management, so I like to make sure that people are prepared moving forward. And I really think it's a good idea if you're going to go into any type of policy project to make sure that you have the checklist that you need, you have an inventory of all of them, you have some type of template that you're going to use every time you create a new policy or update a policy, and you have your policy committee. And policy committees are appointed every year. But you can have the same people serving on policy committee year after year, and that's fine. Just make sure that all of this stuff is in place, and you make sure that you know where these policies live, the original ones, so you can make sure that you update them. I like every time there's a policy update, I save the old version of the policy for a while. It's not in our document retention schedule or anything, but I just think it's important in case somebody comes with a question like next year, like, hey, what was this update that you made? I can just look back and see what the old policy read, and then I can see what it was, and it's a little bit easier for internal housekeeping and stuff like that.
Ron, do you want to take 2 more quick questions?
Yeah, sure. Go for it. I love
All
questions.
right.
I like
Our
questions
board-
more than straight talking. So any questions you have, throw them at me.
All right. Our board approves a policy motion in 2 consecutive meetings. Is this a thing?
So my guess is that policy motion in 2 consecutive meetings. Do you review it at one policy and then wait until the next policy to actually officially enact it so it's approved? If so, that is a thing. And it's not a bad idea to do it. That's if we can do it, that's what we do at the system level too. What I have done is on our agenda, if it's a new policy, it'll show up as a discussion. So for example, we have our brand identity policy that Suzanne wrote for us. So at the March meeting, it was on our agenda as a discussion item, and then at the next meeting, it'll be on there as an approval item. So the policy doesn't go into effect until it's approved, but we do have this 2-step process. And this allows the board a little bit of time to actually take a bit of a deeper look at it. So instead of just seeing it for the first time and improving it, even though they should have read it a week in advance, it just gives a little bit more time because the policy committee was able to sit with it, so the board can sit with it for a little bit. And it's just good practice if you're not in a rush. We have proposed and approved policies in a single meeting if we need them right away, but there's some that there's some that just don't need that. If you have it written somewhere, then you have to do it. If it's just kind of this general procedure, it's not a bad idea to do.
Yeah, and that's like something, back in March when people were implementing those mask policies, like that's something that really couldn't be like, well, let's review it in March and then adopt it in April. Like it was something that needed to be adopted right away. So in those emergency situations, you can just go ahead and do it in one sitting. But when you have time, take your time for sure. Next question, do you need a debit card policy?
Yep. If you're using a debit card, you should have it just like a credit card policy. So any financial things you should have in place.
And then if there's a personnel committee and a policy committee, who should review/develop employee handbook policies? Both?
Oh, good question. So usually any policy that has to do with staff, I leave up to the personnel committee. Sometimes I do have stuff go through personnel and policy or policy and personnel, depending on what it is. But generally, staff handbook is personnel, and then other types of internal operational policies or external policies goes to the policy committee. So if it has to do with staff, go to the personnel. That's how I operate. But you can have it go through both for kind of an extra set of review. That's not a bad idea either. But you don't have to. We good?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, next item, and we have it's 6:45 right now. I promised you'd be an hour, so I'll get through the rest of this stuff quickly. We'll probably go over 7, but if you have to leave, I won't be offended when we hit 7 o'clock. But definitely feel free to shoot your questions. Keep shooting your questions at me because I love seeing those. So the next section we have here is policy development. And these are kind of the steps that you should take as you are considering writing policies, whether this is a drafting new policies or just taking a look at the existing policies that you have. So step one is identifying a need. So making sure that you are writing policies where you actually need to have the policy. It may be something where you don't necessarily need to have it, or the reason that the policy exists or the reason that you're thinking about it may not be as appropriate. Because down at the bottom, I do mention some pitfalls, and one of them is writing policies for maybe one specific circumstance rather than what your organization needs. For example, let's say you have a library director, and he has this really strange, gnarly facial hair going on. Okay. You're not going to write a policy that says no facial hair in the library because you have one instance of it, and you're not going to write a policy for that one individual. You're going to talk to that person about the appropriate appearance or something like that if you need to, or if there's a conversation that needs to be had, but you're not going to write a policy based on one human being. Okay. You want to make sure that you separate those conversations with people versus what policies have, because some people write policies just to hide behind. You don't want to do that. Make sure that you're thinking beyond this moment for how this policy is going to impact your library for the duration of this policy. So that's something critical that you're going to want to consider every time. You can develop a policy because of you have a response to a need or an anticipation for need. One thing to keep in mind is if you're writing a policy because you're responding to something, if it already happened and you handled it and then you write a policy, you can't necessarily retroactively apply that to the people that were involved with that situation. So if you're developing retroactive policies, you just want to be really careful. The classic example of this is if you don't have a public comment policy and then you allow somebody from your public to comment at your board meeting, they can talk as long as they want. You don't have a policy to stop them. So you want to make sure that you have a public comment policy in place before you run into that situation. And it's a lot easier because you can have tough restrictions on that. And then when you say, well, that worked out okay, but it was pretty tight, we can loosen it up at a future meeting, and that's fine. But you can't just automatically say, we approve a public comment period just to get this guy to stop talking. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind as you go through that. That's an extreme example, but there's certain situations where it can cause problems. It's best to constantly assess the library's activities, responsibilities, and community to develop appropriate policies before they're needed. Pretty much what I said. Think critically about what your library may encounter in order to develop appropriate policies, and also consider what's going to happen as you move forward with this. Because like I said, when you write a policy, you have to think about how people are going to enforce that. You have to think about not just we want to stop this behavior, we want to prevent against this behavior. What's that person on the front line going to do when somebody actually does this, and then they have to hold up a policy and say you can't do this? It's very difficult to have that interaction, even if you're enforcing a policy. So as you're looking through the need of it, make sure that you consider, what does it look like when we actually carry this policy out? And this can happen in kind of the later stages of this too, as you're drafting it. Identify the responsibility. So who is going to write the policy? It is extremely inefficient to have an entire committee write a policy. You should have one person in charge of the initial draft. This can be the policy chair, it could be the library director. In a lot of cases, those are usually one of the two people that are going to be in charge of it. Once the initial draft is created, then you can have the rest of the committee comment on it and develop it, and then you bring it to the full board for approval. So just make sure you know who's responsible for it, because if you say, man, we really got to update these policies, and you don't have anyone in charge of it, or if the whole committee's in charge of it and you never get around to doing it, it's going to lapse policy dates. You want to make sure that you have a single person in charge of it, just like you would with a project. If you don't have a project manager or a point person, it's going to be very difficult for a group of people to carry that to the finish line. Gather all your information. So you want to make sure that as you're writing policy, there's a whole heck of a lot of laws that you have to think about when you're doing it. You can't write a staff policy that says, when you're here, you're not allowed to take any breaks when you have a 7-hour work shift because there's labor laws that you have to consider, right? So you can't say that we're going to collect 0 bids on this $100,000 construction project because there's procurement laws that exist. So you have to make sure that you understand that your policies aren't impeding any laws inappropriately. So like I said earlier, laws and regulations, and then it falls to the library stuff underneath. You have to do your homework a little bit and have a general understanding of what laws is this policy going to impact. And it's pretty easy. If you're talking about developing a personnel policy, you figure out what the topic of that policy is, and then you just research it a little bit. You see, okay, well, this dress code policy, is it going to infringe on anybody's religious attire or something like that? Oh, it is? Well, then that's interesting. So you can't write it the way that you originally had it written. You'll have to make sure that you are upholding the laws and regulations that are in place too. Draft policies. So after you've considered all the laws and other real quick. So you want the laws, but you also have to make sure that your policies are consistent with all your other policies too. And when I did our staff handbook review recently, there was different information written in different sections of our staff handbook that said all kinds of different stuff. So as you're developing these, you want to make sure that one of your policies isn't superseding or conflicting with another policy. So that's a good, in that little note section of your policy inventory, you can sometimes write little things like that. Like our conference travel policy needs to make sure that it's up to date with our meals policy when people are at continuing education events or something like that. Make sure that the policy is worded in a way that's appropriate to those who will be expected to implement it. So there can sometimes be a situation where you want to make the policy language kind of sound authoritative, and it makes it a little bit complex. So it's a bit harder for people to understand exactly how they're going to enforce it. Think about the people who are on the front lines enforcing this policy and write it so they are able to explain it to the person they have to enforce it to. If you have a code of conduct policy and somebody's breaking the code of conduct of your library, you want to make sure that people can appropriately explain that and they're not fumbling over a bunch of jargony terms or words in that said policy. You want to make sure that you talk to other trustees as well as staff. And the staff, even though the trustees are developing it, the staff are oftentimes the people who are implementing it. So you want to make sure that you talk to them. And if they say, well, this policy isn't going to fly because this reason, this reason, this reason, that we just don't do business this way, then that's something that you're going to want to consider. Develop corresponding procedures. So like I said, procedures and policy need to go hand in hand with one another. If you are developing policies, you need to have a way on how those are going to be carried out. It could be something where you don't develop the procedures right away. Maybe you see how you're implementing the policy and then you just do it after the fact. And that's okay too, on how you want to do it. Present to the board. All policies need to go before the board so they can be officially approved. Communicate these to employees. This is another part where I see where organizations fall short sometimes is the board says, yep, we all approve this policy. That's great. They put it in the policy manual. The staff never hear about it. And then a situation comes up and they're operating against policy and you ask, why are you doing this? And the answer is they just have never heard about this policy. So while the board is the one who approves it, it's the director's responsibility to make sure that those policies, after they're developed that way, are communicated out to all staff. Once you've communicated it to staff, then you want to add it to your website because you have to have those on your website for minimum standards. And then just having a review and revise schedule. So policies need to be reviewed every 5 years, or as Suzanne said earlier, depending on the type, if it's personnel, it should be done every year. If it's technology, would you say, Suzanne, two years?
Yeah, I don't know if technology needs to be done every year, but 5 years is a big gap.
Yeah, I would say we'll put our 2 years done. Technology, 2 years. That's what we'll do. Revise when they're no longer relevant. So if you have a policy that doesn't make sense anymore, revise it, or you may just get rid of it altogether, and that's fine. If you're going to get rid of a policy, that has to be a board action too. So if you're going to revoke a policy, it needs to appear on your agenda that you're revoking this policy, and you're probably going to want to tell your board why you are revoking that policy, so they have a good explanation on why they are doing that.
It's just something I want to add real quick. When you let your staff know what the new policy is, it's also helpful to explain the why that policy was implemented. Because I think sometimes frontline staff might not understand and they have a hard time enforcing it if they don't know the reason that policy was put into place. So I think if it's something that has to do with the frontline staff, it's something they're going to be implementing, giving them a little bit of a why and explaining how that policy came to be or why it's needed or how it's going to benefit the library, I think is really important to have your staff really vested in what they're doing.
Well put. The other considerations, these items appear in the trustee handbook, so you can read those if you want. It kind of covers everything that we've talked about up here as well. I do want to touch on some things to avoid when you're talking about policy development. So there's a nice balance. You want to make sure that you're not writing too few policies. So if you have 5 policies governing your entire organization, then that's too few. You need to make sure that you're covering some other ground. If you have a couple hundred policies governing your whole organization, that's probably too many. And it's going to be really difficult to make sure those are up to date and they're not in conflict with one another. I said earlier, don't write policies for one standalone instance. If a staff member comes in and their skirt is shorter than you think they should be, you should not write a dress code policy saying no skirts, because how is that going to impact every other employee in every other situation moving forward? Not to mention there's a lot of other implications that could be too. So you want to make sure if there's an instance where one person does something that you don't like, you don't write a policy for it. You have to do a little bit more digging. Same with the facial hair example I gave earlier. It's going to impact a bunch of other people just because you have an issue with this one circumstance. So policies are not meant to protect against one situation. It's supposed to be how the laws of the library that apply to everybody. They don't create a law, a bill isn't introduced that impacts one individual. It's the entire, whether state, nation, depending on its federal or state law. Make sure that you inform staff about policies. Suzanne mentioned this too. You don't want to, you want to make sure that policies are written in a way that staff aren't going to feel the need to hide behind the policy and not reconsider it if it's outdated. So if policy is written and you've been following this policy for decades and somebody comes up and says, I'm not going to, I don't agree with this policy, it's outdated, it's not right. You don't want to say you have to follow it because it's policy. Like Suzanne said, there should be some type of justification that goes with the policy too. And if you can't justify a policy, maybe it's time to take a look at it and not deal with it or not have it anymore. It's time to get rid of it. And then confusing policy and procedure. So you want to make sure that policies, those are the rules, procedures are just how it's carried out.
Which is perfect for the question in chat.
Oh, what do we got, Suzanne?
That says, do procedures of a policy require board approval?
No. So procedures are just the local kind of how things happen. Policies are the only thing that needs to be approved. You just want to make sure that the policy and the procedures aren't out of sync with one another. And you want to carry it out the right way between the two of them.
Right. So the Board of Trustees, they're going to adopt the policy and they're ultimately responsible for setting the policy in the library. And then they're going to say, okay, director, as the person in charge of our organization, you are going to help enforce this policy. And that's where the procedures will come in. So, those day-to-day, how things get done, that's going to fall to the director and the staff. But the policy, that overarching policy, falls to the Board of Trustees. So that's kind of like the difference. So it might be like, this is our collection development policy, and this is how we, this is what's going to guide the materials that we add, the materials that we read, and how we reconsider materials. But then those like little day-to-day, you know, that's going to fall to the director or the staff, or, you know, whoever does like the leading and, you know, those, you know, and Baker and Taylor and adding stuff to the cart. So it's kind of like that hierarchy. So the board of trustees doesn't come in and tells the staff how to do the things. They just say, this is the law of the library. This is what needs to be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, it's good. And you said Baker and Taylor, and that made me think it's kind of a good example of this would be, so the library sets the budget, right? And you say, this is your collection budget for books. The board isn't purchasing those individual books. That's more of the procedure. So that budget line is kind of like the policy, the actual purchasing of those individual items. That's the procedure that the director's carrying out. So think about it that your governance director's day-to-day management. The lovely thing about policy development is rarely do you actually have to create a policy from scratch, because we have policies that you can find just about anywhere. There's a caveat with that. If you are in need of a specific policy and you Google that policy and you say, oh, look, this one from this university in Wisconsin is a Word document that I can just download and put our logo on it. You're going to want to make sure that you read through that policy critically. One, because with the internet, you can get policies from all over the place. And just because they have a policy titled the same as yours doesn't mean that they are upholding the same state laws or local laws that you would need to follow in your organization. So just because it comes from a bigger organization doesn't mean it's a better policy. And not all policies are one size fits all. Most are scalable, but you need to take a look at them and make sure that you look at it critically with the size and scope of your organization to make sure it fits. Under policy resources here, if you ask me for a policy, these are the two places that I go. Our policy list. So we have all of our policies. Right here, it's listed on this docs page, but we also have them all on our website. So these are all of our internal policy or our external policies, with the addition of most of our financial policies, because we have procurement, petty cash, stuff like that. So you can look at these. We have our resolutions and statements on here. Your board probably won't have too many resolutions, but I don't know, maybe you will. So these are all our policies that you can take a look at. And again, not all of them are going to be appropriate for a library. So you look at this list and you're like, oh man, where's our ILL to correctional facilities policy? Well, you probably don't need one. We're a system, so we're a little bit different of an organization. The other one that I like to point people in the direction of is Geneva Public Library. They have a pretty good list of all of their policies that are on here. With everything that they have, a lot of them are similar to the policies that we have at the system level, but they may incorporate some more just how libraries deal with things rather than how the system deals with things. So if Geneva's a school district public library, so all the financial policies here will work well for school districts as well as municipal libraries. And in my opinion, association libraries should adopt them too. But there are some financial policies that perhaps an association library doesn't want to have. So they would change it quite a bit than what's here. But these are the two areas that I would recommend if you're looking for a specific policy, start here. If you don't see it on the list of the system policies or the Geneva public library policies, thanks, Geneva. I think I saw Santa on the call earlier. So thanks, Santa, for doing all that work for us. But if you don't see them on this list of Geneva policies or the system policies, then maybe reach out to us and just let us know what policy it is to see if you actually need to have it in place, because maybe you don't. And you'll notice that not all the policies that are on the system page or even Geneva's page are incorporated in this in the whole list of the recommended policy checklist, because maybe there's some that we just don't need, so we don't include them on there, which is fine. So maybe you feel like you don't need a website policy, and that's okay. If you really truly believe, and as I said earlier, if you can justify not having it, then maybe you don't need it. Make sure your policies are upholding the law the way they need to be upheld. and make sure that you are not going to get in trouble with the policies that you have in place right now, and make sure that they're up to date. With all of that, and with these two places that you can go to grab just about any policy that you need, what questions do people have? Feel free to drop them in chat or go ahead and unmute yourself. It's 7:05 right now, so if you have to go, I understand. But if you want to stick around and talk a little bit about some policy questions, feel free to stick around and ask. Social media policy. Yes, you should have a social media policy. There's a couple different ways to do social media policies. So we have our nice little social media policy here. And this can be an internal or an external thing, but Suzanne, she knows everything about social media. Go ahead.
I recommend most libraries that have a social media policy have something in place that sort of governs staff use of social media policy. So it might have like your internal guidelines, like who sets up the accounts, when do you post, what kind of content do you post, password storage. So, but I also recommend, especially, I was recommending this pre-COVID, but I think during COVID, when we pivoted a lot of our services online and a lot of our programming online, especially if you're using YouTube and Facebook, I think it's important to have an external social media policy, and that will help to guide almost like a code of conduct or a meeting room policy, but for online. So how you expect, how you might moderate comments, what kind of comments you might moderate, who you might have to ban from your page. If you did have to ban someone from your page, how they can appeal that decision. So I do think that you could have like an all-in-one policy that addresses the internal and the external, but you can have two separate ones, but you should definitely address both parts of it, because you want to make sure that if you're hosting your programming online or you're using social media to really communicate with your community and have that open dialogue, that if something unfortunate happens, you're able to address that in a timely manner, and in a manner, you can point back and say, well, this is our policy, this is what's acceptable on our YouTube channel. So I think it's important to have both.
And we have I just pulled up our employee handbook. So we have a social media policy in there, and we also have some guidelines and a social media policy, kind of an external facing one as well. And with this, we would just want to make sure that your internal one and your external one match up the way that they're supposed to, if there's any overlap in anything. Cool. What else we got? And Liz, I can send you any of those that you want. Our social media policies on our website. I'm pretty sure Geneva probably most definitely has a social media policy somewhere on here. Yep, right here. So Geneva has one. We have two of them, and you can take a look at those and see how it fits in with your social media and how you have it set up. And that's okay too. Like, you can take a look at the multiple policies and then kind of create a hodgepodge of all 3, 4, 5 of them, whatever, this applies to us, this doesn't apply to us, and you can have it set up that way too. I just pulled up chat. Yes, please. Yeah, sure, Liz. I'll send those to you. No problem. All right. What else we got? And you have to run, I understand. Any other questions? You can throw them in chat or take yourself off mute. Make sure you have policies. Is there anything that I missed, Suzanne, that we should have talked about tonight that we didn't?
No, it's very thorough. One thing that I like to mention, or when writing policies, and something that I was working on when I was still in the library, is just making sure that the language that we use in policies isn't excluding anybody, that, we're promising that the staff can understand it, but also that it's, like I was changing all the his, her pronouns in our policies to them, there. So, or you could just say the patron, so just making sure that your policies do apply to every single person in your community, and that they don't make anybody feel excluded or not welcome, or that, the rules that govern your library don't apply to them in some way. So I just think it's important that you're very mindful of just the different language that you're using as you go forward with your policy development.
And what I have up on the screen right now is our employee handbook, and you'll notice that it's a pretty dense handbook, is 159 pages. But you'll want to make sure that your employee handbook, this is one of those things that we review every year. We contract with an outside consultant firm that develops the newer policies that need to be put in place with it, and then we update this appropriately. So if you don't have an employee handbook that has things that talk about like how you're handling paid sick leave, or if if you have vacation time, there should be a policy that backs that up, and you want to make sure that all that stuff is included in your policy the way that it should be.
Yeah, I know this seems overwhelming. This seems like a lot, but having these policies in place, it's really to protect the library. That's your job as trustees and directors, is to protect the library. And so slowly working through this checklist and putting in place what you need to is in the best interest of the library, and it matches with that oath of office that you took as a trustee. And it's so hard when something happens and there wasn't a policy in place, and the library really has to take its lumps. So just be proactive, get these policies in place. You may never have to use these policies, or you may never have to use some of these policies, but just in case, you will be ready.
And then we got a question in chat. So we have a reference to sexual harassment and grievances related to that in our personnel policy, but think we need to have a general non-harassment, non-discrimination policy in our external policies as well to cover patrons, board, etc. Your thoughts? So internally we have our combined non-sexual or combined non-harassment, non-discrimination, and sexual harassment policy. So every library, you're required to have a sexual harassment policy as an employer in New York State. You can get it right from the New York State website. We are happy to send that to you as well. But it sounds like what Liz is asking is, should there be a kind of an external facing sexual harassment policy. And that's not a bad idea to have. You can have it. So if you take a look at Geneva's right here, their sexual harassment policy, so this is up to date with with what is on the state website. And when you look through the policy, this is basically to anybody who is at the library, any staff member, patron, because if you have a staff member who's sexually harassed, they can draw claims. If you have a staff member who's sexually harassed by a patron and you decide you don't want to do anything about it, you can have claims brought up against you. So whether it's you have to have a sexual harassment policy, and then if you have some reference to it in a code of conduct policy or something like that, you have to have it. But if a patron reports sexual harassment to you from a staff member or vice versa, or staff on staff or whatever, you have to make sure that you are ready to be able to handle that type of thing, because it's something that is taken very seriously and should be taken very seriously. And you want to make sure that it's followed appropriately in the policies that you have. Your internal one may be slightly different than an external one. Or you may have kind of your overall sexual harassment policy and then some additional information for the internal version of it. That goes along with, not only do you have to have a sexual harassment policy, but all staff members have to receive the annual sexual harassment training. And according to our attorney, trustees should receive that training as well, because they are technically the employer of the library director. I know not all library boards are up to pace with that, but it is out there, so it's something to consider. Any other thoughts or questions? Things you really wish I would have talked about that I didn't, or things that I talked about that you really wish I hadn't? And since we're quarter after, I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. And then Suzanne and I are happy to stick around for a bit and answer any other questions that may pop up too.